When I was in the 10th grade, my parents threw me out into the cold because they thought I was pregnant. Exactly 20 years later, they suddenly showed up at my front gate, demanding to see the child. But when I opened the door, what they heard left them completely speechless. "What child?" I asked coldly. "What on earth are you talking about?" "My name is Camilla, and I am 35 years old. Today, I am a venture capitalist running a $500 million business empire in Silicon Valley." But my family knew absolutely nothing about this until they saw my face on the cover of a magazine. That was when they decided it was time to cash in on the teenage daughter they had thrown away like trash 2 decades ago. Before I dive into the details of this nightmare reunion, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. And if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who only care about your money, please give this video a like and subscribe. The quiet of a Saturday morning was shattered by the harsh buzz of the intercom at my front gate. I put down my coffee and glanced at the security monitor. My entire body froze. Standing outside my iron gates were the ghosts of my past. My mother, Beverly, was wrapped in an expensive fur coat, radiating arrogance. My father, Richard, was red-faced and visibly impatient. Standing right next to them was my older sister, Sydney, the undisputed golden child of the family, clinging tightly to the arm of her husband, Terrence. Terrence was a hard-working, highly successful architect, but he always looked exhausted, worn down by Sydney's endless financial demands. Next to this family gathering stood a bored-looking process server, holding a thick stack of legal papers. "Sign the papers, Camilla," Richard shouted aggressively through the static of the speaker. "The court has granted us grandparents' visitation rights. Hand over the child you've been hiding from us, and pay us the support we are owed." I didn't panic, and I didn't cry. I calmly pressed the button to unlock the gate and walked down my long driveway to face them for the first time in 20 years. Every step I took on that stone driveway was proof of my survival. I had built my company from nothing, turning early tech startups into global powerhouses. It took me 20 years to transform the terrified 15-year-old girl they abandoned into a woman of steel. They expected to find someone weak who could be intimidated into giving up her fortune. Instead, they were dealing with someone who was fully prepared to defend her ground. "Stop playing dumb!" Beverly screamed before I even reached the end of the walkway. "You were a pregnant 15-year-old embarrassment when we kicked you out into the snow. We know you had that baby. You owe this family for the emotional damage you caused. If I hadn't kicked you out that night, you never would have found the drive to become rich. Your entire empire is thanks to my tough love." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. She was exactly the same as she had always been, obsessed with appearances and completely lacking any real maternal instinct. She genuinely believed that abandoning a teenager in the dead of winter was an act of heroic parenting. My father, Richard, puffed out his chest, trying to look like the intimidating figure he used to be. But all I saw was a desperate old man whose own logistics business was reportedly on the verge of bankruptcy. They didn't see a daughter, they saw a winning lottery ticket. "Let us see the child," Richard ordered, taking a step forward as if he had the right to force his way onto my property. I looked down at the legal papers the process server had just handed me, and then I looked back at the people standing before me. "What child?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. "What are you talking about?" Sydney stepped forward, a malicious smirk spreading across her face. She reached into her designer bag, pulled out a glossy magazine, and slammed it against my chest. "Look at this and weep, little sister," Sydney sneered. I glanced at the cover. It showed a paparazzi photo of me leaving a charity gala. The headline read, "Billionaire venture capitalist Camilla leaves $500 million empire to her 20-year-old child." "The secret is out," Sydney said triumphantly, crossing her arms. "You hid your child to keep all the money for yourself. But we have legal rights to our grandchild. We are taking custody today, and we are taking control of the trust fund." I didn't even blink. Instead, I ignored my parents and Sydney entirely, and turned my attention straight to Terrence. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, his eyes shifting between his wife and the massive estate behind me. "You are a brilliant architect, Terrence," I said smoothly, watching him stiffen. "You work 80 hours a week just to support Sydney and maintain her country club lifestyle. Tell me, did she happen to mention to you that the $50,000 she needed last month was for Beverly's emergency heart surgery?" Terrence frowned, genuine confusion crossing his face. He nodded slowly, clearly wondering how I knew about their private finances. "Beverly never had heart surgery, Terrence," I said with a cold smile. I checked. Sydney used your hard-earned money to pay off Beverly's secret gambling debts. They are draining you dry." Terrence snapped his head toward Sydney, his jaw tight. "What is she talking about?" Terrence asked, his voice dangerously low. "You told me the doctor needed that wire transfer immediately to save her life." Sydney's smug expression instantly vanished, replaced by pale panic. "Terrence, honey, don't listen to her. She's just trying to cause trouble because she is twisted and malicious. She's trying to distract us from the fact that she's hiding our family's heir." But Terrence pulled his hand away from her and took a step back. Terrence had always been an outsider to them. Despite his incredible success building a respected architecture firm, he had constantly compromised his own peace to fit into their snobbish family dynamics. He had been working himself to the bone just to prove he was a worthy provider for their golden child. Seeing that they were exploiting his exhausting labor to fund their secret vices was the wake-up call he needed. The truth about his wife's financial manipulation was settling in. He looked at Beverly, who looked remarkably healthy for a woman who supposedly had open-heart surgery just 4 weeks ago. The pain of betrayal was written all over Terrence's face. Before I could order my security team to remove them from my property, the phone in my pocket vibrated. It was an urgent alert from Jared, my company's chief legal counsel. I answered the call right in front of them, keeping my eyes locked on my father's greedy grin. "Camilla!" Jared's voice sounded breathless and furious on the other end. "I just got off the phone with the court. The judge just granted their emergency motion based on that ridiculous magazine cover and their sworn affidavits. Your personal bank accounts have been frozen, pending a mandatory custody and financial support hearing tomorrow morning. They are trying to drain you before you even step into the courtroom." I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. My parents were smiling broadly, completely unaware that the trap they had just set for me was about to become their own prison. I had survived things far worse than frozen bank accounts, and I was about to show them why I was the most feared venture capitalist in the state. I slid my phone back into my pocket and looked at them through the iron gates. A heavy silence hung in the cold California air. My parents stood there, faces flushed with greedy anticipation, absolutely certain they had backed me into a corner. They had no idea they were standing on a trap door that I was about to pull open. Terrence was the only one not smiling. He stood frozen, processing the financial bombshell I had just dropped on him. The $50,000 he had earned through sweat and blood for his children's future had been stolen to cover Beverly's gambling debts. He turned slowly to Sydney. The look of utter disgust on his face left no room for doubt. He didn't yell. He simply reached out his hand and demanded the keys to his car. Sydney's confident facade crumbled instantly. "Terrence, honey, wait," she stammered, her voice shaking as she reached for his arm. "That's a lie. She's just trying to manipulate us." Terrence slapped her hand away as if he had been burned. He snatched the keys from her fingers and walked away without looking back. Sydney chased after him down the road, her designer heels clicking frantically against the pavement, leaving Richard and Beverly standing alone outside my gate. They glared at me, trying to maintain their intimidating stance, but the cracks were already showing. "We will see you in court tomorrow morning," Richard spat, poking his finger in my direction. "Bring your checkbook, Camilla. You owe us for the hell you put this family through." I didn't say a single word in response. I turned around, walked up the driveway, and signaled my security team to secure the perimeter. I walked into my quiet house, straight through the living room, and into my private garage. I got into my car and told my driver to head directly to the headquarters of Pinnacle Ventures downtown. The 20-minute drive gave me time to compartmentalize my anger. By the time the elevator doors opened on the top floor of my firm, my emotions were completely locked away. I walked into the glass-walled conference room with total precision. Jared, my chief corporate counsel, was pacing the room anxiously. Documents were scattered across the large mahogany table, his tie was loosened, and he looked more panicked than I had ever seen him in our 8 years of working together. "Camilla, this is a disaster," Jared said, rushing toward me the moment I entered. "They hired Marcus Vance, one of the most aggressive family law attorneys in the state. Vance specializes in creating high-profile media spectacles. They filed an emergency motion this morning, convincing the judge that you are a flight risk who is trying to hide assets to avoid paying back child support." I sat at the head of the conference table and crossed my legs. "The judge froze your personal accounts based entirely on a magazine cover," Jared explained, rubbing his face in frustration. Vance argued that your charitable trust is actually a front to launder money to your biological child. They are leaning heavily on grandparents' rights laws, demanding the judge immediately set up a $10 million escrow fund to ensure the grandchild's well-being. On top of that, they want full custody and damages for emotional distress. Jared stopped pacing, leaned his hands on the table, and looked me dead in the eye. Camilla, I have protected your empire for nearly a decade. If we are walking into a mandatory custody and financial support hearing tomorrow morning, why did you never tell me you had a 20-year-old child? I need the absolute truth right now. I met his gaze without blinking. I reached into my leather briefcase, bypassed the corporate ledgers and financial projections, and pulled out a thick, worn medical file. Its edges were yellowed with age, held together by a thick rubber band. I dropped it in the center of the table. The heavy thud echoed sharply against the glass walls. I don't have a child, Jared, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous register. But what those monsters did to me 20 years ago is about to cost them their freedom. Jared hesitated before pulling the file toward himself. He snapped the rubber band and opened the cover. As he read the first page, the color drained completely from his face. He looked up at me from the faded hospital records, his eyes wide with shock. Camilla, they threw you out while you were going through this? His voice was barely a whisper. I was 15, I explained, standing up and walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city skyline. I started experiencing severe abdominal pain, and my period stopped. Terrified, I went to a pharmacy and bought a cheap pregnancy test. It came back positive. I was an A student, a quiet, obedient kid, and I was scared to death. I went to my parents crying, begging them to help me. Richard backhanded me across the face, calling me a disgrace who would ruin his business reputation. Beverly shoved my belongings into black plastic trash bags. They pushed me out the front door into a freezing winter rainstorm. While I sat on the porch bleeding, they changed the deadbolts from the inside. Jared looked physically sick, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the medical documents. But the test was positive. What happened to the baby? There was no baby, I stated flatly, turning around to face him. I collapsed at a bus stop 2 miles from their house. A stranger found me unconscious and called an ambulance. I was taken to a free charity clinic downtown. The doctors ran a full diagnostic ultrasound and blood work. The results showed ovarian choriocarcinoma. It is an extremely rare, highly aggressive cancerous tumor that secretes massive amounts of pregnancy hormones. That is what caused the false positive on the test. I wasn't pregnant. I was on the brink of death from cancer, and my parents threw me away like garbage because they wouldn't even bother to take me to a doctor. Jared stared at the clinical evidence of my nightmare. His legal mind immediately began calculating the devastating impact this would have in court. Camilla, the judge is going to completely destroy them. He took a deep breath. I want them ruined, I corrected him, tapping my fingers on the glass table. They want to drag me into court tomorrow to demand $10 million for a grandchild that doesn't exist. I am going to let them. I want them to commit perjury on the witness stand. I want them to swear under oath on the public record that they know for a fact I gave birth to a child. And then I am going to slam this medical file on the judge's desk. A fierce, predatory look of understanding flashed in Jared's eyes. He immediately grabbed his legal pad and began mapping out our courtroom strategy. Just as he began listing the traps we were going to set for their perjury, my phone chimed sharply in my pocket. I pulled it out to find a text message from Sydney. It was a screenshot of a local news broadcast. Richard and Beverly were on the screen, standing outside the courthouse, dabbing their eyes with tissues, playing the role of heartbroken, victimized grandparents for the local media. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Billionaire daughter hides secret heir from heartbroken grandparents." Below the photo, Sydney had typed a message filled with arrogance. Checkmate. Bring your checkbook tomorrow, or the media gets the rest of the story. I stared at the glowing screen. I felt no sadness, no anxiety, and no fear. All I felt was the cold, mechanical precision of a predator locking onto its prey. They had walked into a war they could never win, armed with nothing but a tabloid headline. With a steady hand, I typed out my reply, hit send, and tossed the phone onto the table. I am preparing the hearse for your reputation. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across the polished oak of courtroom 4. Outside the heavy wooden doors, a crowd of reporters and camera crews jostled for position, fueled by the media spectacle my family had carefully manufactured. Inside the courtroom, the air was suffocatingly tense. I sat straight at the defense table next to Jared, my tailored dark gray suit acting as my armor. Across the aisle, my parents and Sydney sat at the plaintiff's table, crowded around their high-profile attorney, Marcus Vance. Beverly wore a conservative beige two-piece outfit, completely abandoning her usual loud luxury brands to play the role of a modest, heartbroken grandmother. Every time the judge looked her way, she dabbed her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Richard sat with slumped shoulders, playing the part of an exhausted patriarch who had endured unimaginable grief. Marcus Vance stood before the bench, using his booming, theatrical voice to paint a sickeningly sweet picture. "Your Honor, we are here today to correct a tragic injustice," Vance began, placing a hand over his heart. "My clients, Richard and Beverly, are upstanding, loving parents. For 20 years, they have carried the absolute agony of being separated from their only grandchild. Their daughter, Camilla, became pregnant at the tender age of 15. Out of teenage rebellion and resentment, she ran away, abandoning a home filled with love and resources, depriving these devoted grandparents of the opportunity to raise their own flesh and blood. I didn't move a muscle. I kept my hands neatly folded on the table, my expression completely unreadable. Jared wrote furiously on his legal pad, occasionally glancing at me to ensure I was still composed. I was beyond composed. I was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Vance paced back and forth, gesturing dramatically toward my parents. For 2 decades, they searched, grieved, and prayed for the safe return of their daughter and grandchild. And now, through public financial disclosures, we have discovered that Camilla has left her $500 million empire to this very child. Yet, she refuses to produce the heir. We have reason to believe she is actively hiding the child and liquidating assets to avoid paying the 20 years of retroactive child support my clients deserve for their emotional trauma. Judge Harrison, a magistrate known for his strict adherence to traditional family values, frowned deeply. "These are incredibly serious allegations, Mr. Vance. Do you have witness testimony to support this timeline and these claims of hidden assets?" "We do, Your Honor," Vance smiled smoothly. "I call Sydney to the stand." Sydney stood up, smoothing the wrinkles of her modest floral dress. She walked to the witness stand, took the oath with perfect solemnity, and sat down. She looked at me, and for a fraction of a second I saw the malicious smirk hidden behind her practiced grief. Then she turned to the judge, her lower lip trembling right on cue. "Sydney, please tell the court what happened 20 years ago," Vance guided gently. Sydney let out a breathless, manufactured sob. "Camilla was always jealous of me. She hated that our parents held us to high standards. When she got pregnant in the 10th grade, she completely spiraled. Out of spite, she tried to ruin my 16th birthday party, throwing a massive tantrum and demanding that our parents focus only on her mistake. There it was, the fictional background story she was inventing under oath. She was twisting my terrifying medical crisis into a teenage tantrum meant to steal the spotlight from her birthday party. It was the ultimate execution of the golden child and scapegoat dynamic we grew up with, now being presented as sworn evidence. Sydney wiped away a non-existent tear from her cheek and leaned closer to the microphone. "Our parents begged her to let them help raise the baby. They offered to pay for everything, medical bills, baby clothes, a college fund. They just wanted to keep our family whole, but Camilla laughed in their faces." Beverly let out a loud, dramatic wail from the plaintiff's table, burying her face in her hands. Richard wrapped a comforting arm around her, shaking his head in fake grief. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Sydney sniffed, her voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. "She told me she was going to hide that baby forever. She even threatened to sell the baby to the highest bidder just to humiliate our family name and punish my parents for loving me. She ran away that night, and we spent years desperately looking for her. It ruined my parents. And now my own husband, Terrence, left me yesterday because the stress from my sister and her cruel lies completely broke our marriage." I felt Jared stiffen beside me. Sydney wasn't just lying. She was committing blatant, documented perjury. She was digging a hole so deep that even Vance wouldn't be able to pull her out of it. I remained motionless, my heart beating with cold, mechanical precision. Every lie she told was another nail in their collective coffin. Vance turned to the judge, raising his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "Your Honor, as you can see, this is a documented pattern of vengeful, destructive behavior. Camilla is a billionaire hoarding wealth while her family suffers the consequences of her teenage rebellion. We ask the court to immediately freeze her remaining assets and order her to produce the 20-year-old child today. Sydney stepped down from the stand, keeping her eyes downcast like a martyr. She took her seat next to Beverly, gripping her mother's hand tightly. Judge Harrison removed his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He was clearly moved by Sydney's performance and my parents' fake tears. He turned a stern, unforgiving gaze directly onto me. The air in the courtroom grew heavy with anticipation of my downfall. "Ms. Camilla," the judge's voice echoed in the silent room, carrying the full weight of his authority. "The testimony we have heard today is deeply troubling. This court takes the hiding of children and the deliberate evasion of family responsibilities extremely seriously. Your corporate disclosures clearly show a massive transfer of wealth designated for a 20-year-old recipient identified as your child." He leaned forward over the bench, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute severity. "I am warning you now. Failure to produce the 20-year-old child mentioned in your financial documents will result in an immediate finding of contempt of court and the seizure of your assets. Where is the child?" I met the judge's stern gaze without a hint of fear. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the frantic scratching of pens from the reporters in the gallery behind me. Marcus Vance stood with a smug smirk, confident that his dramatic ambush had backed me into a corner. Across the aisle, my parents leaned forward in their heavy wooden chairs, practically salivating at the prospect of my financial ruin. Sydney sat back with a satisfied, innocent expression, playing the role of the traumatized sister perfectly. They had walked into a legal war armed with a tabloid headline, completely unprepared for the heavy artillery I had waiting for them. I rose slowly from my seat, deliberately buttoning my tailored suit jacket. I didn't reach for a birth certificate, nor did I pull out trust fund ledgers. I simply picked up the thick, yellowed medical file from the defense table and requested permission to take the stand. Judge Harrison gave a brief nod, his expression hardening as I walked past the plaintiff's table. Completely ignoring my family, I took the oath, sat in the wooden chair, and placed the heavy, worn folder on the edge of the desk in front of me. "I do not have a child, Your Honor," I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the courtroom sound system. "There is no 20-year-old heir, and my parents have no secret grandchild to claim." Vance practically leapt out of his chair, his face turning bright red. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is lying to the court. We have her corporate tax filings right here. The Pinnacle Ventures Charitable Trust explicitly designates a $10 million fund to a biologically dependent minor. She is committing perjury right now to escape paying my clients what they are owed." "Objection overruled," Judge Harrison barked, slamming his gavel down to silence the attorney. "Ms. Camilla, you are walking a very dangerous line. If there is no child, you need to explain those financial disclosures immediately. What is in that file?" I slid the thick folder across the polished wooden surface of the witness stand, and the bailiff carried it up to the bench. "Those are my complete medical records from 20 years ago," I explained, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They include diagnostic reports, surgical records, and pathology results from St. Jude's Charity Clinic downtown. I ask that they be entered into evidence. As for the financial documents, Mr. Vance is intentionally misrepresenting them. That $10 million escrow fund is a pediatric oncology research grant. The dependents or recipients listed on those documents are sick children sponsored by my firm. The tabloids twisted a tax filing into a secret child, and my family saw a lottery ticket." Judge Harrison opened the file. As he scanned the first page, his brow furrowed deeply. The courtroom became so quiet you could hear the low hum of the air conditioning. 20 years ago, I was a 15-year-old honor student," I began, turning my gaze toward Richard and Beverly. They instantly froze in their seats. I started experiencing severe abdominal pain. The pain was so intense I could barely stand, and my cycle stopped completely. Terrified and confused, I went to a local pharmacy and bought a cheap pregnancy test. It came back positive. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Vance kept his arms crossed, still looking smug, believing I was simply confirming his entire case on the record. "I was just a child," I continued, my voice carrying a cold, unwavering authority. "I was scared to death. I did what any child would do under those circumstances. I went to my parents. I walked into their immaculate living room crying, begging them to take me to a doctor. I begged them to help me." I paused, letting my eyes lock onto my father. Richard swallowed hard, a sudden bead of sweat appearing on his forehead. He finally realized where this testimony was going, but he was powerless to stop it. My father did not offer to help raise a baby, I testified, tearing Sydney's fabricated story apart piece by piece. He did not offer to pay for medical bills or a college fund. He backhanded me across the face, knocking me to the floor. He called me worthless, saying that bringing a scandal to his doorstep would ruin his logistics business. My mother, Beverly, offered no comfort. She went upstairs, shoved my clothes into black plastic trash bags, and dragged me to the front door. They threw me out into a freezing winter rainstorm. I sat on the porch, bleeding and crying in agony, while they changed the deadbolts on the other side of the door. "Objection!" Vance shouted, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "This is irrelevant hearsay designed to distract the court from the core issue of custody." "Sit down, Mr. Vance," Judge Harrison snapped, his eyes never leaving the medical file in his hands. The color was rapidly draining from the judge's face as he turned to the second page of the official hospital records. The hostility that had been directed at me just minutes prior was completely gone, replaced by deep shock. "Continue your testimony, Ms. Camilla," the judge said. "I dragged my trash bags through the freezing rain for 2 miles until I collapsed at a bus stop," I said, ensuring every reporter in the room captured every word. "A stranger found me unconscious and called an ambulance. I was taken to the free clinic because I had no insurance, no money, and no family. The doctors there performed a full diagnostic ultrasound and detailed blood work. I turned my head to look at my parents. Beverly was gripping Richard's arm tightly, her knuckles completely white. The triumphant confidence that had filled their faces just moments ago had entirely evaporated. They were staring at me with pure terror. "They didn't find a heartbeat," I stated clearly. "They didn't find a baby. I wasn't pregnant, Your Honor." The silence in the room was absolute and heavy. "I had ovarian choriocarcinoma," I announced, dropping the final medical bombshell into the dead quiet of the courtroom. "It is an extremely rare, highly aggressive cancerous tumor. This specific type of tumor secretes massive amounts of HCG, the exact same hormone produced during pregnancy. That is what caused the false positive on the test." Gasps erupted from the gallery. Reporters dropped their pens, scrambling to record the twist. A loud, shocked murmur broke out among the wooden benches as the public realized what my family had actually done all those years ago. "I had a tumor, not a baby," I declared, my voice cutting through the rising noise in the courtroom like a knife. While I was bleeding in the streets, dying of advanced cancer, my loving parents were busy changing the locks to protect their social status. Judge Harrison stared at the pathology reports bearing my name, the official stamps of the clinic, and the detailed records of the emergency surgery that had saved my life at 15. He slowly lowered the file, his hands trembling slightly against the bench. He looked past me, locking his gaze onto Richard, Beverly, and Sydney. The three of them looked as though they had just been struck by lightning. Beverly's face turned a sickly pale color, her mouth open in silent horror, as the reporter's camera flashes blinked behind her. Richard stared straight ahead, his chest heaving as the reality of his ruin began to set in. Sydney sat frozen in her chair, her fake tears long gone, her eyes wide as she realized she had just committed felony perjury over a cancerous tumor. The judge's face transformed from stern authority to pure, unadulterated fury. Judge Harrison slammed the medical file down onto his desk with a sharp crack that made Sydney jump in her chair. He glared down at Marcus Vance, who was currently gripping the edges of the podium as if the floor had just vanished beneath his feet. "Mr. Vance," Judge Harrison began, his voice dangerously low. "I am looking at certified medical records from St. Jude's Clinic. These documents confirm a diagnosis of ovarian choriocarcinoma. They confirm emergency surgical intervention. They confirm a pathology report for a malignant tumor. At no point do they confirm the existence of a child." Vance swallowed hard, his slick confidence entirely gone. "Your Honor, I was not informed of this evidence." "You presented a sworn witness to this court," Judge Harrison roared, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "You put this young woman on that stand to testify under penalty of perjury that she witnessed her sister threatening to sell a non-existent baby. You had your clients file an emergency motion demanding $10 million based on a completely fabricated premise. You are weaponizing my courtroom to perpetrate a blatant, malicious extortion scheme against a woman who was fighting for her life." "My clients assured me the timeline was accurate, Your Honor," Vance interjected, visibly sweating. He took a hasty step away from Richard and Beverly, desperate to distance himself from the sinking ship. "Save it for your disciplinary hearing, counselor," the judge snapped, cutting him off. He turned his furious gaze onto my family. Sydney was shaking violently. The reality of committing a felony on the public record was crashing down on her. She looked to Richard for help, but my father was paralyzed. The arrogant patriarch of the family was pinned to his seat by the sheer weight of his own undone plot. Beverly sat with her mouth open, staring at the medical file on the bench as if it were a venomous snake. Judge Harrison raised his gavel. "The emergency motion is denied. The petition for grandparents' rights is dismissed with prejudice. The freeze on Ms. Camilla's personal and corporate assets is lifted immediately. Furthermore, I am instructing the court clerk to forward the transcript of today's proceedings directly to the district attorney's office. I am formally recommending charges of perjury and fraud against Sydney, Richard, and Beverly." He brought the gavel down with a thunderous strike, sealing their fate. In the gallery, reporters erupted into frantic whispering and typing, eager to be the first to publish the dramatic downfall of a family that tried to extort a billionaire. I sat motionless, taking in the absolute finality of the moment. Beside me, Jared let out a long, heavy exhale and leaned back in his chair with a look of pure awe. He closed his legal pad. We didn't even have to present a defense. The trap had snapped shut exactly as planned. I rose slowly, my composure flawless. I reached down, slid the medical file back into my leather briefcase, and snapped the brass latches shut. Every eye in the courtroom was locked on me. I had walked in as their prey, but I was walking out as their executioner. I turned and walked down the center aisle, the crisp, confident click of my heels echoing in the heavy silence. As I reached the plaintiff's table, I stopped. Richard stared straight ahead, too cowardly to meet my eyes. Sydney was sobbing, crying real tears of sheer terror, completely ignored by the parents who usually rushed to comfort her. Beverly finally looked up at me, her face a portrait of utter defeat. She looked old, fragile, and completely exposed. The glamorous grandmother persona had been shredded, leaving behind the bitter, cruel woman she actually was. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face just inches from hers. I didn't raise my voice. The quiet precision of my words was devastating enough. "You always loved the spotlight, Beverly," I whispered, locking onto her panicked gaze. "Enjoy the warmth." Beverly flinched, shrinking deep into her wooden chair as if the words were a physical blow. She buried her face in her hands, trying to hide from the harsh reality she had created. I straightened up and continued toward the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom. The victory tasted cold, but it was absolute. I had cut the last rotting tie to the people who shared my DNA. My empire was safe. My past was buried. I reached out to grab the brass handle of the door, ready to walk out into the bright California sun and leave them to the legal slaughterhouse. But right as my fingers touched the cold metal, the doors burst open from the outside. I stepped back quickly as a breathless, flushed man in a sharp pinstripe suit forced his way into the courtroom. He completely ignored the bailiff who reached for his arm and marched down the center aisle, waving a thick stack of legal documents in the air. I recognized him instantly. It was Arthur Sterling, my father's chief corporate attorney for his logistics company. "Your Honor, wait!" Sterling shouted, his voice hoarse from running. He bypassed the gallery and stopped right behind Richard's chair. "Do not lift the asset freeze. We are filing an immediate separate injunction." Judge Harrison, who was already halfway out of his chair to adjourn, froze. He glared at the intruder with renewed fury. "Who are you? How dare you disrupt my courtroom?" "Arthur Sterling, representing Richard's holding company," he panted, slamming the documents down onto the plaintiff's table. "This is no longer family court jurisdiction, Your Honor. This is commercial theft." Jared was on his feet beside me in an instant, his legal instincts kicking in. "Objection. This hearing is concluded. Any commercial dispute belongs in civil court, not here." "It belongs right here because the assets she controls were stolen from her family," Sterling yelled back, pointing a trembling finger straight at me. He looked up at the judge, a flush of desperate triumph on his face. "Camilla embezzled her entire startup capital from the family trust 5 years ago. We have the forensic accounting, we have the bank wires, and Your Honor, we have a signed contract proving she drained millions from her father to build her firm." Dead silence gripped the courtroom. The reporters stopped typing. Judge Harrison froze, his hand hovering over his gavel. Slowly, Richard raised his head, a sickening, familiar sneer creeping back onto his face. Arthur Sterling stood panting at the plaintiff's table, his manicured hands flattening the thick stack of documents against the wood. My father's sickening grin widened. Richard had just played his trump card. He knew he couldn't win a moral debate over my medical records, so he shifted to the arena where he believed he held absolute power: corporate warfare. Judge Harrison took the documents from the bailiff, his expression tight with renewed annoyance. "What exactly am I looking at, Mr. Sterling? This court just dismissed a fraudulent custody claim. You are on incredibly thin ice." "It's a binding promissory note and equity transfer agreement, Your Honor," Sterling replied, his breathing finally leveling out. 5 years ago, using a shell company, Camilla routed $5 million out of the Richard and Beverly Logistics Family Trust. That stolen capital was the exact seed money used to launch Pinnacle Ventures. Under the strict terms of this contract, signed by Camilla herself, a failure to repay the principal within 48 hours of a specified maturity date triggers an automatic default. The penalty is an immediate transfer of a 51% controlling stake in Pinnacle Ventures directly to Richard. She is in default. Jared bolted from his chair, snatching our copy of the filing from the bailiff. He flipped through the crisp pages, his eyes scanning the dense legal text with sharp precision. I leaned over, staring at the final page. There it was, my signature. The elegant sweeping curve of the C, the sharp clarity of the M. It was absolutely flawless. "It's a forgery," I whispered to Jared, my voice barely audible over the sudden buzz of whispering from the press gallery behind us. "I never took a dime from them. I built Pinnacle with independent venture capital." Jared's jaw tightened. He pushed his glasses up his nose, holding the document up against the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. "It's an incredibly sophisticated forgery," he murmured back, tapping his finger against the bottom corner. "Look at the notary stamp. It's legitimate. They bought a notary or had someone on their payroll backdate the seal. We can prove it's fake during discovery, but right this second, it carries massive legal weight." "Your Honor," Jared announced, his voice cutting through the room and breaking Sterling's smug silence. "This document is an absolute fabrication. My client has never engaged in any financial transactions with her family's trust. This is a desperate retaliation tactic designed to extort my client after their initial perjury was exposed." Sterling scoffed loudly, slapping the podium. "The signature is notarized, the funds were routed through offshore accounts that match her initial corporate filings perfectly, and we have a full forensic accounting trail. We request an immediate referral to the commercial division and a temporary injunction against Camilla. We demand her voting rights at Pinnacle Ventures be suspended until ownership is formally resolved." Judge Harrison rubbed his temples. The righteous anger from the medical records disclosure was still visible on his face, but his hands were tied by protocol. A notarized commercial contract presented a massive jurisdictional hurdle that couldn't simply be brushed aside in family court. "I am thoroughly disgusted by the blatant perjury regarding the medical records," Judge Harrison said, glaring coldly at Richard and Beverly. "Do not think that matter is settled. However, a disputed notarized equity contract falls under commercial jurisdiction. I cannot summarily dismiss this case here. I am ordering this specific financial dispute transferred to the commercial court for immediate review." The judge brought down his gavel with a heavy thud. "Pending a hearing in the commercial division, I am granting a temporary 48-hour injunction. Ms. Camilla, your voting rights and executive authority at Pinnacle Ventures are frozen for 2 days to prevent any liquidation of disputed assets. Court is adjourned." I didn't wait for the bailiff to dismiss us. I stood up, grabbed my briefcase, and marched down the center aisle. Reporters shouted questions, flashes went off directly in my face, but my eyes were locked on the heavy oak doors. I pushed through them, stepping into the wide marble corridor of the courthouse. The air outside felt heavy with the storm of the corporate war to come. Before I could even reach the elevators, a heavy hand gripped my shoulder. I spun around instinctively, slapping the hand away. Richard stood there, towering over me. The panic he had shown inside the courtroom was completely gone, replaced by the arrogant, narcissistic hubris I remembered from my darkest childhood memories. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, looking down his nose at me. Sydney stood a few paces behind him, her fake tears wiped away, a vicious smirk playing on her lips. "Did you think you were clever?" Richard sneered, his voice dropping to a low, intimidating gravel. "Did you really think you could beat me in a courtroom? I taught you everything you know about business. I was building an empire while you were learning to tie your shoes. You're just a little girl playing dress-up in a tailored suit." I stared back at him, my expression like ice, refusing to give him even a flicker of satisfaction. "You taught me leverage is everything, Richard. You just bought yourself 48 hours. Enjoy the countdown." Richard let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "In 48 hours, I am going to strip your company to the bone. I am going to liquidate your assets, fire your board, and erase your name from the masthead completely. You should have stayed out in the rain where you belonged." He turned on his heel, signaling for Sydney to follow. They walked toward the opposite elevators with the confident stride of predators that had caught the scent of blood in the water. I pulled out my phone and dialed my chief operating officer before I even stepped foot into my car. The war had just escalated. An hour later, the sleek, glass-walled lobby of Pinnacle Ventures headquarters was dead silent. The usual energetic hum of startup pitches and ringing phones had completely ground to a halt. I stood behind the main reception desk, flanked by my head of security and my lead developer. The temporary injunction meant I legally could not authorize trades, move capital, or execute executive orders. In my own building, my hands were legally tied behind my back. The polished stainless steel doors of the private executive elevator dinged loudly. They slid open, and Richard stepped out first, flanked by 4 burly private security contractors wearing tactical earpieces. Sydney marched right behind him, carrying a stack of legal binders, dressed in a loud designer outfit as if she were treating my corporate headquarters like her personal shopping mall. Arthur Sterling walked to their right, holding the judge's signed injunction like a shield. Richard looked around the massive, modern office. He took in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, the multi-million-dollar art installations, and the dozens of terrified employees peering over their glass cubicles. His eyes gleamed with pure, unadulterated greed. "Clear the executive floor!" Richard boomed, his voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. He didn't even look at me as he gave the order. He pointed a finger at my head of security. "You work for me now. Escort this woman off the premises immediately. We are executing a hostile takeover of Pinnacle Ventures." Sydney marched right up to the reception desk, slamming her stack of binders onto the surface directly in front of me. She leaned over the polished counter, her eyes flashing with malicious ecstasy. "Pack up your desk, little sister," Sydney whispered, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness. "I want your corner office." I looked at Sydney, her face flushed with the greedy anticipation of a scavenger about to claim fresh prey. I didn't even blink, and I didn't raise my voice. I simply gestured toward the sleek, glass-walled office at the end of the hall. "Take it," I replied, my voice steady, completely devoid of the panic she was desperate to see. "I hope you find the chair comfortable, Sydney. You won't be sitting in it for long." Richard didn't waste a single second. He treated my corporate sanctuary like conquered territory, practically vibrating with the thrill of the intrusion. He snapped his fingers, and the 4 burly private security guards he brought with him immediately fanned out across the executive floor. They moved with aggressive precision, pulling plugs on monitors, seizing hard drives, and physically blocking my employees from accessing their workstations. Richard marched down the central hallway, pointing thick, manicured fingers directly at my lead developers, financial analysts, and administrative staff. "You're fired!" Richard boomed, his rumbling voice bouncing off the floor-to-ceiling windows, shattering the quiet focus of the office. "Pack your personal belongings into boxes and get out. You're fired. If anyone touches a secure server or tries to wipe a drive, I'll have you arrested for corporate espionage. This building belongs to me now." My employees stood up, absolute fear in their eyes. They clutched their laptops, looking toward me, their CEO, for direction. I caught the eye of my lead analyst, David, and gave him a slow, deliberate nod. I needed them to comply for now. I needed Richard to feel invincible, to believe his ambush was going flawlessly. Chaos rippled through the space as filing cabinets slammed, personal items were shoved into cardboard boxes, and the guards hovered intimidatingly over my team. Right as Richard was threatening to have my chief of staff physically dragged to the elevator, the polished steel doors dinged once more. Terrence walked onto the floor. Sydney's husband looked completely out of his depth. He wore a rumpled beige suit, a deep, painful look of extreme discomfort etched into his face. Terrence was a high school history teacher, a man who always seemed too quiet, too empathetic, and too genuine for the toxic orbit of my family. He stared at the unfolding takeover, his eyes wide with horror as he watched one of Richard's hired thugs roughly push a young intern away from her desk. "Richard, stop this!" Terrence pleaded, walking forward with his hands raised in a desperate gesture of peace. "You can't just storm in here and intimidate innocent people. This is a legal dispute, not a mob shakedown. Let the commercial courts handle the transition of power." Before Richard could even turn around to respond, Sydney spun on her heel and marched straight up to her husband. Her sweet victim facade vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a chilling, hysterical rage. "You're defending her?" Sydney shrieked, poking her finger hard into Terrence's chest, forcing him to take a step back. "After everything she did to us? Camilla is a thief. She embezzled millions from my father to build this entire place. She is stealing generational wealth from our children. This building, these assets, they belong to our kids. If you had an ounce of backbone, Terrence, you'd be helping my father take back what's ours instead of crying over fired secretaries." Terrence flinched, absorbing the verbal abuse like a man who had endured it 10,000 times before. The gaslighting was suffocatingly high pressure. Sydney used their children like human shields, weaponizing his paternal instincts to justify her own absolute greed. She turned away from him, storming toward the reception desk to demand the master server passwords from a terrified IT technician. Terrence stood frozen for a moment, his shoulders slumping with defeat, and then his eyes met mine. He kept his head low, avoiding Richard's attention as he navigated the chaos toward me. He pulled me gently to the side, into the shadow of a massive structural pillar near the break room. His face was etched with a deep, exhausting sadness. "I didn't want any part of this, Camilla," Terrence whispered, his voice thick with genuine pain. "But Sydney says you stole from her. I'm just trying to protect my kids." I looked at him, really seeing the toll this marriage had taken on his soul. Terrence wasn't malicious. He was a good, decent man trapped in Sydney's toxic web, slowly being choked by her endless manipulation. He genuinely believed he was protecting his family from a corporate predator because Sydney had fed him a steady diet of carefully crafted lies. "Terrence," I said softly, ensuring my voice carried only to him. "I didn't steal a single dime. That contract is a brilliant forgery. Your wife and her father are currently committing corporate fraud, and they are using you as collateral damage. I need you to take a step back, stay completely quiet, and watch exactly what happens next. You're about to see who Richard really is." Terrence swallowed hard, giving a tiny, stiff nod. He receded back against the textured wall, melting into the background as the hostile takeover continued to rage around us. At the far end of the hall, Richard bypassed the smaller executive suites and walked straight into my private boardroom. It was the nerve center of Pinnacle Ventures, a massive room encased in smart glass, with a flawless marble conference table at its center. Richard didn't condescend to sit in the plush guest chairs. He walked straight to the head of the table and slammed his heavy frame into my custom leather CEO chair. He propped his feet up onto the polished marble table, wearing expensive Italian loafers, crossed his hands behind his head, and began to spin arrogantly. He looked like a feudal king claiming a throne after a bloody conquest. He caught sight of me standing in the hallway, stopped his spin, and threw me a look of absolute dripping contempt. "Go pack your desk, little girl," Richard ordered, his voice carrying perfectly through the open double doors, dripping with narcissism and misogyny. I didn't go pack my desk. I walked down the corridor with measured strides, the sharp click of my heels instantly silencing the chaos around me. I crossed the threshold into the boardroom. My head of security, who had been patiently waiting for my signal, immediately stepped into the hallway and pulled the heavy glass doors shut behind me. I pressed the electronic deadbolt. A loud mechanical click resonated through the space, sealing Richard and me inside. Richard's smug grin froze for a fraction of a second. He lowered his feet from the table, suddenly keenly aware as the smart glass walls frosted over instantly, turning completely opaque and cutting off all visual and audio contact with the outside world. We were entirely sealed inside a soundproof vault. I walked over to the primary control panel on the wall. I pressed a button, lowering the blackout blinds over the frosted glass and activating the massive overhead projector. The screen whined to life, casting a harsh, bright light directly across Richard's confused face. I turned to face my father, my expression perfectly calm and entirely lethal. "I'm not going to argue about the fake contract, Richard," I stated, my voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Let's talk about your logistics company instead." Richard leaned back in my custom leather chair, letting out a harsh, mocking laugh that bounced off the frosted smart glass walls, trapped inside the soundproof vault I had just sealed us in. He crossed his arms over his expensive tailored suit, radiating the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "My logistics company?" Richard scoffed, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. "You're completely delusional, Camilla. My company is a titan in the global supply chain industry. I have commercial shipping contracts spanning 3 continents. You're locked in a room trying to deflect from the fact that I just legally seized your little venture capital project. I have your signed promissory note. You have nothing. You're grasping at straws because you know you've lost." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look away. I simply raised my right hand and pressed a small button on the master remote. The massive overhead projector hummed, throwing high-definition images directly onto the glass wall behind me. The sudden burst of light washed over Richard's face, illuminating the instinctual defensive twitch of his jaw. Projected onto the wall was a highly confidential, exhaustive internal balance sheet. It was a bloodbath of red numbers, plummeting profit margins, and heavily defaulted vendor payments. "You used to be a titan, Richard," I corrected, pacing slowly and deliberately in front of the glowing screen. 20 years ago, you built something impressive, but the market evolved, global technology advanced, and your massive ego refused to adapt. Your logistics company has been dying for a decade. You've spent 10 long years bleeding capital, losing vital contracts to modernized competitors, and quietly mortgaging your personal properties just to make payroll and maintain the illusion of your wealth at the country club. Richard's hands gripped the armrests of my chair. His smug, victorious sneer vanished, replaced by a furious, panicked scowl. He leaned forward, his eyes darting frantically across the projected figures. "These are illegally obtained corporate documents," he roared, his deep voice echoing harshly. "I can have you arrested for industrial espionage before the sun goes down. You have no idea what you're looking at. You don't understand complex corporate debt restructuring." "They aren't stolen," I replied smoothly, pressing the remote again. The slide shifted instantly to a multi-million-dollar commercial loan agreement spanning 50 pages. The signature at the bottom of the screen was unmistakable. Richard's coarse, aggressive handwriting sat right next to a heavy corporate notary seal. "When traditional banks finally looked at your actual numbers and stopped returning your calls, you got desperate," I explained, watching the color slowly drain from his face. "You needed an immediate injection of raw capital to keep the lights on and preserve the illusion of your great fortune. You took a $15 million lifeline loan from the Blackwood Fund. You thought you were dealing with faceless bankers from a high-floor office. You thought you were outsmarting a faceless private equity firm." Richard scoffed loudly, trying to claw back a shred of his shattered bravado. He waved a dismissive hand at the projector. "Private equity loans are standard business practice for a company of my scale. I secured mezzanine capital to optimize our supply chain routes. The debt is entirely manageable. Blackwood is a massive, aggressive institutional hedge fund. Pointing out my corporate debt changes nothing about your current situation, Camilla. I answer to the board at Blackwood, not to an ungrateful daughter who got lucky and is playing CEO." I stopped pacing. I stood directly at the end of the long marble table, leaning my hands flat against the cool surface, looking him dead in the eye. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and suffocating. "And that is where you made your catastrophic mistake," I stated, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "When I came to this city, I didn't just build Pinnacle Ventures. I built an entire network of diversified financial holding companies. 3 years ago, when the Blackwood Fund was quietly restructuring its leadership, I executed an aggressive buyout through a series of offshore shell companies. I am the absolute majority shareholder behind the Blackwood Fund. You don't answer to a faceless board of bankers, Richard. You answer to me. I own your debt. I own your company." Richard fell back into the leather chair as if he had been physically struck. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His chest began to heave, his breathing shallow and rapid. The reality hit him like a freight train. He was sitting in my chair, in my building, surrounded by my security, only to realize that the entire foundation of his life was held firmly in the palm of my hand. "You're lying," he wheezed, the booming authority completely stripped from his voice. "That's impossible. Blackwood is a strict institutional lender. They audit everything. They certainly do," I agreed, clicking the remote to the final, most devastating slide. "Which is why their loan covenants regarding capital allocation are incredibly specific. That $15 million loan was strictly designated for fleet modernization, technological infrastructure upgrades, and employee retention. I pointed to the highlighted section on the screen. It was a forensic accounting roadmap, tracing a series of wire transfers directly out of his logistics company's accounts and into a private real estate escrow fund. You didn't modernize your fleet, I continued, delivering the final blow with surgical precision. You didn't upgrade your technology. You violated the terms of the loan when you routed company capital to purchase Sydney's luxury estate. You took millions meant to save the jobs of your blue-collar workers and used it to buy a 6-bedroom mansion in the Hamptons so your golden child could play house. You committed federal corporate fraud just to spoil the daughter you actually kept. Richard clutched his chest, beads of sweat breaking out across his forehead. He stared at the wire routing numbers projected on the wall, the undeniable ironclad proof of his massive financial crime. To fund Sydney's extravagant lifestyle, he had committed severe fraud, completely unaware that the daughter he threw away like garbage was the one holding all the receipts. That was an advance on her inheritance, Richard stammered blindly, trying desperately to rationalize the undeniable truth. That was an internal family transfer. I am the CEO. I have discretion over capital expenditures. You committed embezzlement, I corrected sharply, stepping away from the table and walking back to the glass doors to deactivate the deadbolt. You defrauded a private equity firm, and the contracts you signed contained ironclad provisions regarding the misappropriation of funds. I don't need a 48-hour commercial court review to enforce it. I am triggering the default clause right now. I placed my hand on the digital lock, looking back at the man who had thrown me out into the freezing rain 20 years ago. The penalty for default is the immediate recall of the loan, I said, my tone absolute and unyielding. You have exactly 24 hours to pay me $15 million in cash, or I will seize every single asset under your name, including the roof you sleep under. I watched the last bit of color drain from Richard's face. The untouchable family patriarch, the man who had controlled our family with an iron fist and a bottomless checkbook my entire life, was now collapsing into my custom leather chair, gasping for air. I didn't pour him a glass of water. I didn't offer a single word of comfort. I simply turned my back on him, pressed the wall panel to raise the blackout blinds, and deactivated the deadbolt. The heavy glass doors slid open with a soft hiss, reconnecting us to the chaotic roar of the executive floor. A moment later, Richard stumbled out of the boardroom, looking like a man who had barely survived a devastating car crash. He held onto the doorframe to steady himself, his expensive tailored suit suddenly looking a full size too large. His breathing was heavy and ragged. Sydney immediately marched up to him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, completely oblivious to his physical condition. She was practically vibrating with malicious excitement. "Well," she demanded, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor, "did you fire her? How fast can we get IT to transfer access to the main servers? I want my interior designer here tomorrow morning to tear down all this horrible modern aesthetic." Richard didn't answer. He stared blankly at his favorite daughter, his jaw opening and closing silently as his brain short-circuited under the massive weight of his financial ruin. "Dad!" Sydney snapped, her voice rising an octave as a sharp edge of panic finally crept into her tone. "What is wrong with you? Order your security team to throw her out. Don't just stand there." Arthur Sterling, the eternal corporate parasite, stepped forward and grabbed Richard's arm, shaking him gently. "Richard, what did she say in there? What is the status of the commercial injunction?" "She owns it," Richard whispered, his voice trembling so violently it was barely audible over the stunned background noise of the office. "She owns the Blackwood Fund, the entire $15 million. She triggered the default. We have 24 hours, Arthur. In 24 hours, she seizes everything." The words hit the group like a physical shockwave. Beverly, who had just stepped out of the private elevator ready to join what she thought would be a victory parade, dropped her luxury handbag. The heavy thud echoed in the suddenly silent lobby. "What do you mean she owns Blackwood?" Beverly screamed, rushing forward to grab her husband's lapels. "Richard, tell me you are joking right now. The logistics company, our estate, the personal accounts—" "Everything," Richard confirmed, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperate to avoid my gaze. "She holds the notes on all of it. We are in absolute default. There is no legal loophole out of this." Sydney recoiled, her perfectly made-up face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The reality of impending poverty hit her like a physical blow. "The Hamptons house?" Sydney gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. My country club membership, the kids' private school tuition, you paid for all of it with company funds. What happens to my house if she seizes the corporate accounts? It's gone, Sydney, I stated clearly, stepping out of the boardroom to join the crowd. Every single asset purchased with stolen capital faces immediate foreclosure. I suggest you start packing your designer bags tonight. Sydney let out a blood-curdling, guttural shriek. She looked around frantically, her eyes darting like a cornered animal searching for an escape route. Her illusion of untouchable wealth had shattered into a million unfixable pieces. Her gaze locked onto Terrence, who was standing silently near the reception desk. The expression on his face was a picture of quiet horror, as his wife's family's ugly reality was exposed nakedly in front of a room full of strangers. Sydney lunged at him, her manicured hands gripping the lapels of his rumpled beige suit with a death grip. "Terrence, you have to fix this," she demanded, shaking him violently. Terrence looked down at her, his expression a mix of deep pity and absolute disgust. "Fix what, Sydney? Your father committed federal fraud. You used stolen money to fund a lifestyle we could never afford. How exactly do you want me to fix a $15 million commercial criminal mortgage?" "Your architecture firm!" Sydney screamed at him right in the middle of the Pinnacle Ventures lobby, completely discarding any remaining shred of dignity. "Liquidate your retirement. Call your parents and tell them to sell their property in Vermont. You have to save my parents. You have to keep our house." My employees, who had been holding their breath, watched in stunned silence as the golden child of the family suffered a spectacular, catastrophic meltdown. Terrence gently but firmly pried Sydney's fingers off his jacket. He took a deliberate step backward, drawing a physical line between himself and the madness. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice remarkably steady despite the chaos. "That firm is something I spent a decade breaking my back to build from nothing. Those retirement accounts are explicitly set aside for our children's future, for their college education and security. I am not bankrupting my own kids to cover your father's fraudulent debts." Sydney's face turned a deep, furious crimson. Her features contorted into a snarl so vicious she looked unrecognizable. "You coward," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "I should have known you'd abandon us the moment things got difficult. You are a weak, pathetic husband. You're a useless provider. I always knew I married down." Terrence took the verbal blow without flinching. The insult seemed to bounce right off him, cementing a decision he had clearly been struggling with for years. He looked at Richard shivering in the corner, at Beverly weeping over her dropped purse, and finally at his wife, who was currently demanding he ruin his own life just to salvage her grand illusions. "I'm going to go home, pack my things, and take the kids," Terrence said quietly. "My lawyer will be in touch tomorrow." He turned his back and walked toward the elevators. Sydney screamed his name, a sharp, commanding shriek for immediate obedience, but Terrence didn't even break his stride. The elevator doors opened, he stepped inside, and the polished stainless steel doors slid shut, severing his connection to her toxic orbit for good. I didn't stay to watch Richard and Beverly comfort their hysterical daughter. I signaled my head of security to escort the trespassing family off my floor and slipped into the private executive elevator. I pressed the button for the underground parking garage. The air below was cool, smelling faintly of motor oil and damp concrete. I stepped out into the dim fluorescent lighting, walking briskly down the rows of luxury cars. I spotted Terrence immediately, standing beside his modest sedan. He held his keys, but he wasn't moving. He was simply staring blankly at the concrete wall, his shoulders rising and falling with heavy, ragged breaths. The reality of a marriage built entirely on a financial lie was crushing him completely. I approached quietly, my heels clicking softly on the pavement. He snapped his head toward me, his eyes bloodshot and exhausted. "I didn't come down here to gloat, Terrence," I said, keeping a respectful distance. He let out a hollow, humorless laugh. "You have every right to. I stood by while she dragged your name through the mud. I let her convince me that you were the villain. I was blind." "You were manipulated," I corrected him smoothly. "My family has spent decades perfecting the art of psychological warfare. You were just collateral damage in their desperate bid to maintain power." I reached into the pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black USB drive. I stepped forward and held it out to him. Terrence looked down at the device, hesitation written all over his face. "You are a good father, Terrence," I said, making sure he heard the absolute sincerity in my tone. "Don't let them pull you down with them. Look at this before you sign anything." He slowly reached out and took the small drive, his fingers brushing against mine. He gripped the cold metal tightly as the crisp click of my heels faded into the empty parking structure, leaving him completely alone. Terrence stared at the small black device resting in his palm. It felt heavier than a brick. For years, he had operated under the assumption that his wife was just high maintenance and spoiled, but fundamentally committed to their family. That illusion was now hanging by a thread. He unlocked his modest sedan, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. He didn't start the engine. Instead, he reached into the back seat, grabbed his leather messenger bag, and pulled out his work laptop. The screen booted up, illuminating his exhausted features with a pale, harsh light. He stared at the USB port for a solid minute, torn. Plugging it in meant crossing a threshold. It meant admitting the woman he shared a bed with was actually a stranger. With a sharp intake of breath, he pushed the drive into the port. A single folder appeared on the desktop. Its name was simple: Internal Audit. Terrence double-clicked the folder. A massive, highly encrypted PDF document opened, bearing the official watermark of Pinnacle Ventures' top forensic accounting firm. He began to scroll down. The initial pages outlined exactly what Camilla had stated in the boardroom: the $15 million routing of the Blackwood Fund, the blatant violation of the loan covenants, and the funneling of corporate cash to purchase Sydney's massive Hamptons estate. It was all there in black and white, undeniable. But Terrence was a practical man. He already knew Richard was corrupt. What he wasn't prepared for was the second part of the report. He scrolled down to a subfolder labeled with the names of his 2 young children. His heart rate spiked. His chest tightened painfully as he opened the attached bank statements. For the past 10 years, Terrence had practically killed himself to build his architecture firm from scratch. He had sacrificed weekends, missed family dinners, and endured grueling 80-hour work weeks drafting blueprints and pulling permits. He endured all the exhaustion for one single goal: ensuring his children had an ironclad financial safety net. He had set up secure college savings accounts, pouring every spare dime of his income into them. Sydney had always insisted on managing the household finances, claiming his schedule was too packed. He had trusted her completely. He stared at the final line of the current statement. The numbers blurred together, refusing to make sense. He blinked hard, leaning closer to the glowing screen. The balance was 0. Both accounts had been completely, utterly cleared out. Nearly $400,000 of his sweat and blood, his children's entire future, was gone. A cold, sickening sweat broke out along the back of his neck. He frantically clicked through the transaction history, tracing the outgoing wires. The forensic accountants had painstakingly mapped out where every dollar went. Sydney hadn't lost the money in a bad investment. She had systematically drained her own children's college funds to finance her own extravagant illusion of reality. Terrence viewed the line items, his stomach churning. $30,000 wired to a luxury boutique in Paris. $80,000 transferred to a high-end jeweler in Manhattan. There were constant, massive withdrawals to cover luxury car leases, expensive country club dues, and lavish vacations. Expenses she had claimed were paid for by her father. She had been stealing from her own flesh and blood to maintain a status in a social circle that didn't care about her. But the betrayal didn't stop there. Terrence continued to scroll down, his eyes burning as he discovered a second layer of financial deception. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been funneled out of the kids' accounts and into a hidden offshore holding company registered under Beverly's maiden name. An attached summary explained it all. Beverly, the supposedly high society matriarch, had accumulated crushing, catastrophic gambling and shopping debts over the years. Terrified of facing Richard's wrath, Beverly had begged Sydney for help. Eager to secure her mother's approval and maintain the family's glossy facade, Sydney had quietly paid off Beverly's secret creditors using her own children's tuition money. Terrence slammed the laptop shut. The sudden darkness in the car matched the absolute void that had just opened up inside his chest. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, and let out a raw, hoarse scream from the depths of his throat. It was the sound of pure agony, of a man realizing his entire life was a carefully constructed fiction. He had worked himself to the bone to provide for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than an ATM to fund her delusions. Just minutes ago, she had screamed at him for being a useless provider, all while standing on the ashes of the wealth he had literally bled to build for their children's future. The panic and confusion that had tortured him upstairs vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. The obedient, long-suffering husband was dead. Terrence reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed Sydney's number. It rang twice before she answered. "Terrence, please," Sydney sobbed into the receiver, her voice filled with perfect artificial tears. "Tell me you got the loan to save us. We are going to lose everything. You have to fix this." Terrence stared straight ahead at the concrete wall, his voice dropping to a level of pure, unforgiving ice. "I'm coming to the house, pack your bags." The 2-hour drive from downtown out to the sprawling estate in the Hamptons was an agonizing blur. To Terrence, the journey felt like driving to a funeral for a life he never truly owned. His knuckles remained white against the steering wheel as he navigated the winding, manicured roads leading up to the 6-bedroom mansion. Every massive oak tree, every perfectly sculpted hedge, and every iron gate he passed felt like a monument to the massive financial lie he had blindly inhabited. He pulled his modest sedan into the wide circular driveway, parking directly behind Sydney's gleaming white Porsche Cayenne. He cut the engine, the sudden silence inside the car deafening. He looked up at the towering facade of the house. It was a monument built on stolen capital. Richard had committed federal fraud to buy the property, and Sydney had systematically drained her own children's future to decorate it. Terrence grabbed his leather messenger bag from the passenger seat. His face was set into a granite mask. He used his key to open the heavy mahogany front door, stepping into the grand marble foyer. Sydney was pacing anxiously in the center of the sunken living room. She wore a silk designer robe, her hair perfectly disheveled, her mascara artfully smudged beneath her eyes. She had spent the last 2 hours staging the perfect scene, a vulnerable, overwhelmed wife in desperate need of her husband's protection. When she heard the door close, she spun around, letting out a dramatic, breathless sob. She rushed across the marble floor, throwing her arms around his neck. "Terrence, thank God you're back," Sydney cried, pressing her face against his chest, completely ignoring the rigid posture of his body. "I've been so terrified. My dad is losing his mind. Please tell me you went to the bank. Tell me you secured a loan against your architecture firm. We have to move the funds immediately to stop Camilla from destroying our family." Terrence didn't raise his arms to hold her. He stood completely still, letting her cling to him for one long, grueling minute. Then, he reached up, grabbed her wrists, and physically pried her hands off his shoulders. He took a deliberate step backward, breaking the contact. Sydney stumbled slightly, her carefully rehearsed expression of grief instantly dissolving into genuine confusion. "Terrence, what are you doing?" Terrence unzipped his leather messenger bag. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. He walked past her, his heavy steps echoing in the empty room, and slammed the papers down onto the flawless Calicut marble kitchen island. "These are divorce papers," Terrence stated, his voice carrying a low, terrifying calm that Sydney had never heard before. "My attorney drafted this preliminary separation agreement while I was driving. I want the keys to this house, the keys to the Porsche, and every single credit card in your wallet placed on this counter right now." Sydney stared at the thick stack of paper, her mouth opening in shock. Her gaze darted between the legal documents and Terrence's cold face. "Divorce!" Sydney shrieked, her voice echoing harshly against the vaulted ceilings. "Have you completely lost your mind? My father is under a vicious commercial attack by my psychotic sister, and you're here throwing a tantrum about our marriage? You are my husband. You're supposed to protect us." Terrence reached into his bag once more. He pulled out the printed forensic accounting spreadsheets extracted from Camilla's encrypted USB drive. He threw them onto the marble island right next to the divorce papers. The highlighted rows of zero balances glared under the expensive pendant lights. "I read the internal audit," Terrence said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I saw the wire transfers, Sydney. I saw the offshore holding companies under your mother's maiden name. I saw the $80,000 charge at the Manhattan jeweler and the $50,000 bill for the luxury resort." The color drained from Sydney's face instantly. The blood left her cheeks, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. She looked down at the accounting sheets, realizing in a single second that her wall of financial secrecy had been completely obliterated. "You drained our children's college funds," Terrence continued, stepping closer to the island, his anger radiating like heat from a furnace. "You took $400,000 that I bled to earn for our kids, and you used it to pay off your mother's secret gambling debts and buy yourself designer clothes. You stole from your own flesh and blood to finance a lie." Sydney panicked. Her carefully constructed victim persona vanished instantly, replaced by a vicious, frantic manipulation. She slammed her hands flat against the marble countertop, glaring at him across the island. "I did it for our image," Sydney screamed, her voice laced with a desperate sense of entitlement. "You have no idea the kind of pressure I was under. You know how my parents judge us. They expected us to meet a certain standard. Terrence, they expected us to live like the Blackwoods. You're just a high school history teacher who started a boutique firm. The money you make isn't enough to keep up with my family's social circle. I had to maintain our status. I was protecting our reputation." Terrence looked at her as if staring at a corpse. The pure, blinding narcissism required to justify stealing from her own children left him breathless. He didn't yell. He didn't match her hysteria. He simply delivered his verdict with absolute finality. "I sacrificed my peace to fit into your family's snobbish dynamics," Terrence said, his words sharp and precise. "I swallowed every backhanded insult your father made about my background. I ignored every dig your mother made about my paycheck. I played the part of the compliant, quiet, supportive husband because I thought we were building a life together. But I will never let you steal from my children." Sydney gasped, taking a step back as if he had struck her. "You can't take the kids. You can't leave me here." "The kids are already packed," Terrence replied smoothly. "I called the nanny from the car. They're waiting for me upstairs. And I'm not leaving you here, Sydney. You're leaving." "What are you talking about? This is my house." "This house belongs to Pinnacle Ventures," Terrence corrected her, gesturing to the luxurious surroundings. "Camilla owns the $15 million defaulted loan your father used to buy this property. She is seizing every single asset tied to that stolen capital. There will be an official eviction notice pasted on that front door tomorrow morning. You have nothing left." Terrence walked around the island. Sydney stood frozen, paralyzed by the reality of her collapsing empire. Terrence reached into the designer handbag resting on the counter. He pulled out her thick leather wallet, extracting every sleek metal credit card tied to his accounts. He tossed the empty wallet back onto the marble surface, grabbed the keys to the Porsche, and turned his back on her. He walked to the base of the grand staircase and called up to his children. 2 minutes later, he walked out the front door, his children holding his hands, completely ignoring Sydney's frantic, wailing apologies. The heavy mahogany door shut with a dull, heavy thud. Sydney was left completely alone in the massive, silent mansion. The brutal reality of her absolute ruin settled heavily over her. She had no money, no husband, no children, and no home. She collapsed onto the cold marble floor of the kitchen, her designer dress pooling around her. With trembling, frantic fingers, she grabbed her phone and pressed the speed dial for her father. Richard answered on the first ring, his own voice hoarse with panic. Sydney pressed the phone tightly against her ear, real tears of catastrophic terror streaming down her face. "Camilla took him," Sydney screamed into the receiver, her voice breaking into a hysterical, suffocating shriek. "She took Terrence. She took the kids. She took everything." Richard stood frozen in his mahogany-paneled home office, the phone pressed tightly to his ear. Sydney's hysterical screams continued to pour from the speaker, a symphony of pure, unadulterated panic. He didn't offer his daughter a single word of comfort. His hand shook so violently that the device slipped from his grip, clattering onto the massive desk. He let her cries echo through the dead silence of the room until the line eventually went dead. The ornate grandfather clock in the corner struck exactly 8 times. The 24-hour deadline had officially expired. Richard had spent the entire night locked in that office, frantically tearing through his entire Rolodex. He had called every golfing buddy he had ever entertained at the country club, every corporate ally, every rival hedge fund manager, and every private equity contact. He begged, pleaded, and offered disastrously high interest rates for a quick $15 million bridge loan. The responses had been devastating. A straight transfer to voicemail, awkward coughs followed by dial tones, or blunt, unapologetic refusals. The financial world operated on a ruthless grapevine. Word had already spread that the Blackwood Fund was executing a hostile takeover of his logistics empire. No one was going to catch a falling knife, especially when that knife was aimed directly at their own wallets. He had failed. The titan of industry was completely broke. A heavy, rhythmic pounding at the front door shattered the quiet of the early morning. It wasn't a polite knock, it was the sharp, undeniable strike of law enforcement. Richard rushed out of his office, standing at the top of the grand winding staircase. The heavy double oak doors were pulled open by his bewildered housekeeper. Standing on the immaculate marble porch was a team of uniformed police officers, flanked by 2 lawyers in sharp suits and a crew of burly men in gray utility uniforms. Behind them, past the gates, 3 massive moving trucks idled in the manicured circular driveway, their engines rumbling. "Are you Richard Sterling?" the lead attorney asked, stepping into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. He held up a thick stack of legal documents bearing fresh court stamps. "I represent the Blackwood Fund. We are here to formally execute the seizure of this property and all non-exempt physical assets within it to satisfy the defaulted commercial loan. This estate is now legally owned by Pinnacle Ventures. You have exactly 1 hour to gather your personal clothing and vacate the premises." Richard's knees buckled slightly. He gripped the polished oak railing to keep from collapsing. The lawyers didn't wait for his response. They gestured to the movers, who immediately flooded into the house carrying clipboards, heavy boxes, and thick rolls of bubble wrap. The intrusion was swift, surgical, and utterly cold. Men began removing original oil paintings from the walls, carefully logging and packing away the silverware in the dining room, and unplugging high-end electronics. Beverly emerged from the master suite, her face covered in expensive morning cream, wrapped in a plush silk robe. She stopped dead at the top of the stairs, her eyes widening in horror as she watched two movers carry a massive antique vase off its pedestal in the hallway. "What on earth is happening?" Beverly shrieked, her voice echoing sharply against the vaulted ceiling. "Put that down right now!" She rushed down the stairs, nearly tripping over her designer slippers. She threw herself in front of two movers who were currently lifting a gilded Louis XV-style console table straight out of her formal sitting room. She slammed her hands onto the polished wood, glaring at the men as if they were pests. "I said, put it down!" Beverly ordered, her chest heaving with arrogant fury. "This is a private residence. Do you have any idea who I am?" The larger of the two movers paused, adjusting his grip on the heavy antique. He looked her up and down with a look of absolute, magnificent indifference. "Yes, ma'am," the mover replied, his voice completely flat. "A tenant in default. Please step aside." Beverly gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if she had been punched. She looked frantically to Richard, who remained tightly gripped to the railing, completely broken. The reality finally breached the thick walls of her delusion. She was losing her sanctuary. She was losing all the items she used to prove her superiority to the world. 45 minutes later, Richard and Beverly found themselves standing on the cold concrete of the public street outside their own front gates. Beside them were a few meager designer suitcases containing nothing but clothes and basic toiletries. The massive iron gates were chained shut from the inside. A large, bright yellow foreclosure notice was aggressively slapped directly over the family crest on the mailbox. A battered yellow taxi pulled up to the curb. The rear door pushed open, and Sydney dragged herself out. She was an absolute wreck. Her hair was matted, her makeup smeared down her cheeks, dragging a single duffel bag. She had been removed from her Hamptons mansion in the exact same manner. She looked at her parents standing helplessly on the sidewalk and burst into a fresh wave of hysterical tears. "They took the house," Sydney wailed, dropping her bag onto the concrete. "Terrence took the kids. He left me with nothing. We have nowhere to go. What are we supposed to do?" Richard didn't answer. He was staring down at his phone. A bright banner notification had just lit up his screen. It was an automated email dispatch from the City Business Journal, a newsletter he subscribed to for social purposes. The headline practically burned through his retinas. Pinnacle Ventures CEO Camilla Sterling to host annual VIP charity gala at the Grand Atrium tonight. City elite expected to attend. Richard's vision narrowed, his hands slowly curling into tight, shaking fists. While his family stood on a public street like discarded trash, the daughter he had thrown into the freezing rain 20 years ago was preparing to be crowned the queen of the city. She would stand before the wealthiest, most powerful people in their social circle, basking in the glory of her newly secured empire. The pure, blinding humiliation of it ignited a toxic, consuming rage deep inside his chest. He thrust the phone screen into Beverly and Sydney's faces. The tears stopped instantly, replaced by the same vicious anger currently poisoning his blood. "She planned it perfectly," Richard snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly purr. "She timed the foreclosure for the exact same day to celebrate her victory. She wants to parade around like royalty while we sleep in a cheap motel." He grabbed his suitcase, a dark, desperate mania burning in his eyes. "If she wants a show," Richard announced, "we are going to completely ruin her in front of the entire city."